Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. In marking the 10-year anniversary since activists overtook Zuccotti Square Park in New York City, sparking the Occupy Wall Street movement, today we are going to talk about this history with a founding editor of the Occupy Wall Street Journal that chronicled the occupation of Zuccotti Park and the movement that it gave birth to. Arun Gupta is our guest. Arun Gupta writes for a number of publications. He has a new piece out in these times. It is called How Occupy Wall Street Trained a Generation in Class War. His forthcoming book is called Bacon as a Weapon of Mass Destruction, a Junk Food Loving Chef's Inquiry into Taste. He joins us over Zoom. Arun Gupta, it's great to have you back on this program. Thank you for taking the time.
Great to be with you today, Mitch.
Fascinating title of your article in these times, How Occupy Wall Street Trained a Generation in Class War. That rings true to me as somebody who's also been a part of this history and has covered this history in real time up to now. What's first and foremost on your mind, thinking about 10 years since this all started?
First and foremost, and most important, is that the 2010s were the decade of Occupy. Contrary to a lot of cynics, what they said that Occupy was a failure, it most certainly was not. If it did seem like a failure, it's because its hopes and prospects were so wildly ambitious that people thought we're going to take down banks, we're going to take down capitalism, we're going to end this duopoly that serves Wall Street and not Main Street. And so did it succeed in that? No, but it was never going to succeed in that. But what it did is it helped to seed and shape and define a whole generation of activism. And what I've seen, I don't just argue because, as you know, Mitch, I've been going around the country regularly for the last decade, covering movements like low-wage workers movement, Black Lives Matter movement, the climate justice movement, the immigrant rights movement, Bernie Sanders campaign. And everywhere you turn, you see the impact of Occupy Wall Street, often very directly. Sometimes it's a little more subtle, but it is still always there. And you see this impact in various ways. Sometimes it's specifically with the tactic of occupation. You'll even have a direct descendant like Occupy ICE in 2018. As luck would have it, I just happened to show up in Portland, Oregon. Then I flew in the night that it began, and it was just a few activists who camped outside of an ICE office and jail in the city in protest of Trump's family separation policy. That's where they were disappearing thousands of children, and many still remain disappeared. And these few activists ended up sparking a large movement in Portland that then swept around the country. There were about a dozen physical occupations targeting ICE facilities. You also have the tactic of occupying being used in all sorts of movements, especially the climate justice movement. You know, most dramatically, we saw with Standing Rock. Of course, occupations go back a long way in history, but that huge occupation that swelled to over 10,000 people in 2016 to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline, it was very much in the lineage of Occupy Wall Street. The climate justice movement have also used occupations on land and in the sea, and even the air. We've seen blockades of oil trains where people set up occupations on railroads. We saw the phenomena of kayaktivists, where you have hundreds of people taking to rivers and bays and small watercraft to harass ships that are trying to go to the Arctic to engage in oil exploration. And I covered one incident one event where 13 members of Greenpeace dangled from a bridge in Portland, Oregon. They were on lines and in harnesses blocking the path of a Shell oil vessel that was headed to the Arctic to help with the oil exploration. So we've seen all sorts of various impacts.
It is interesting to think about. I have always saw, well, it was its own thing, Black Lives Matter, also something, though, that was connected to Occupy Wall Street that would sort of form after Occupy Wall Street. Of course, the presidential runs by Bernie Sanders that really ignited this country in both 2016 and 2020 again. And as I'm thinking about this last decade has been a decade of activism. And there certainly was activism and protests that were occurring before September 17th, 2011 in this country. But I remember when Occupy occurred, and I was covering Occupy Oakland very closely. It was happening just blocks from where I lived. I remember everyone looking at each other when this was occurring with this look as I've never seen anything like this before. Something shifted.
It was a remarkable moment. I was talking to a good friend of mine, a radical civil liberties lawyer who was very active in the 1960s. He's been politically active now close to 60 years. And I said, when we started to see these occupations just spring up all over the country, at one point there was concurrently over 300 physical occupations going on and thousands of occupied chapters. I think, some people said in total there ended up being something like 1,200 occupations in the U.S. and around the world. We forget that Occupy really spread everywhere. It actually became a huge phenomenon in Hong Kong and Britain and other places. But I said, this is an incredible moment, just like the 60s, in terms of how much this is resonating. And he's like, no, there was nothing like this in the 60s. You have to remember, he said, that the dissent was really kind of centered in the Black community, among students, among anti-war activists, among youth. What's happening is much more broad-based than the 1960s.
Is it accurate to say, well, we may want to say the anniversary of Occupy is September 17th, 2011, and I think that is accurate. But could we also point to what was happening globally at the time? Wasn't there some influence that was happening from what we were calling the Arab Spring before it got so complicated?
Sure. Yes. We first saw the ousting of the dictatorship in Tunisia. That revolt started in late 2010, and I believe it was ousted somewhere around the turn of the new year. And then a month later, Hosni Mubarak, the U.S.-backed, supported, funded dictator in Egypt, was ousted. And that happened right around the same time as what was called the Wisconsin Uprising, which was the massive protests against Governor Scott Walker and his move to gut the power of labor unions. That I think, the Democratic Party ended up snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, as they are very skilled in with that story. But at the moment, this was all very inspiring. And then we saw the movement of the squares in Europe, in Spain, in Greece, these popular uprisings. In New York City, there was all these kind of proto-occupations, including an actual one called Bloombergville, where poverty rights and homeless rights activists and homeless people set up a physical occupation a couple of blocks away from City Hall, protesting the government cuts to social welfare. And that set a very important precedent because a judge ruled that it was protected First Amendment activity. Uh, when we look at Occupy, I think one of the most important lessons is what I would call contingency and accident. I think there's a tendency on the left to just think everything that happens is kind of preordained by the great gods of historical materialism, that they are on high, and I guess it's not Olympus. I don't know where they would be, on some proletarian utopia. But you can't do anything that isn't a total proletarian revolution without having the imprimatur of the ruling class. And not to get off on a tangent, but a lot of the left kind of cynicism towards AOC and her appearance at the Met Gala with Tax the Rich. I saw lots of people commenting about how, that isn't, fundamentally challenging the rule of the owning class. And it's just like, yeah, at least she's doing something. What the hell are you doing? But we have to remember that it's acts like these that you don't know where they're going to go. And that was very true of Occupy Wall Street. Now, I knew about it all summer, the organizing for it, and I knew some of the people who were involved in it. And I honestly rolled my eyes because I was just like, oh my God, it's the same old, like, horizontalism that never really goes anywhere, that we saw a lot with
a lot of people on the left were skeptical at the beginning.
Yeah, well, even before it began, because I'm very much not a proponent of horizontalism, and we will talk about that because it really showed its limits within Occupy. But I went down there to the rally, and it just felt different. And a big part of the reason it felt different was there were I recognized some people, but there were a lot of people I didn't recognize. And sure, New York is 9 million people almost, but still, if you go to demonstrations, you're often going to see, a lot of the same old faces. And then, as the story has been told many times, people marched around, and I believe Zuccotti Park was actually the sixth choice as to where to set up an occupation. And I went there that night to talk to people, and the closest I can describe it as, the mood, the sentiment, the feeling was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's like the Richard Dreyfuss character. No one was building mountains out of mashed potatoes, but people were just drawn there from across the country. I talked to people from Connecticut, from California, from Texas, who came thousands of miles. They just felt they had to be there. And there were only a couple of dozen people who were camping out that night. And it very nearly ended the first night. At one point before midnight, hundreds of police officers lined the steps to Zuccotti Park, and were telling people they were going to be evicted. And then someone else saw this. The New York Police Department is a lawless agency. They're a criminal agency, honestly. When we saw, this is the time when the stop and frisk is going on, where they're essentially running an unconstitutional, illegal apartheid police state, where they're illegally stopping and frisking and arresting millions of black men and Latino men. And so I think the NYPD was making a calculation. Well, the judge said we aren't supposed to bust these hippies' heads because this is protected First Amendment activity. Not that they care about that, but what I really think they calculated was this isn't going to go anywhere. There'll be just a few dozen out here for a few days, maybe a week or two, and then they'll get tired and go home. And so it was an accident. There's the contingencies. You had the atmosphere of Occupy. There were all these groups, like Adbusters is often gets like, oh, they made the call, blah, blah, blah. But there was numerous calls going out. Sure, Adbusters is the one that kind of got media traction because it had that dramatic picture of the ballerina on the Wall Street Bull with the figures in black behind clouds, and they picked a date for it. But there was a general mood that people need to take it to Wall Street. And so what happened after that first night is it just started to slowly grow. And then that's when something really interesting starts to happen. We started to see kind of the Egypt phenomena, which is police violence didn't repress it, it actually gave it power and strength. So on the 1 week anniversary, there was the infamous incident where the women were pepper sprayed near Union Square Park. There was video of them screaming in agony, and the cop who did it, Tony Baloney, as he came to be known, he had it's like Anthony Bologna, but people were calling him Tony Baloney. And it was blatant, right? They were already behind this. The NYPD loves to use this orange netting. I saw it when they first deployed it during the 2004 RNC to literally net bicyclists during critical mass. And so they already had these women trapped, and the use of chemical weapons was just utterly gratuitous. And so Occupy came as a real shock to them, and they were like, "Whoa!" And it was a real shock because if you remember, maybe not in Oakland because Oakland is so full of revolutionaries, obviously where the Black Panther Party is founded, but across the country, you would hear people chanting that the police are part of the 99% in the early days of Occupy, trying to convince the cops that they were part of the 99%. And for those of us who have been covering politics for a while, we were like, we would just roll our eyes because it's just like, if you think, it's just like, they ain't gonna freaking join you. Give me a break. It's just
what happens though, Arun, when your movement suddenly becomes a mass one.
Well, and that's a really important point to remember. And again, it's one of the great things about Occupy, and also one of the things that proved to be a real problem. Occupy, I'm not going to call it wasn't a progressive Tea Party, but there were similarities. One of the things that Occupy did is it bought in the new. That means when you are organizing means you are bringing people who don't agree with you over to your side. You're bringing people who were previously fence sitters or your opponents. The problem is so much of the left conflates mobilizing with organizing. Mobilizing is you're bringing out people who already agree with you. Occupy was this moment of genuine mass organizing where all these people were questioning the system, receptive to the ideas, and you got a lot of people who were frankly had racist ideas. We heard this, my partner and I, Michelle Fawcett, we covered Occupy around the country for a year. We ended up visiting 41 occupations in 27 states. She's actually finishing her documentary on Occupy. She has footage that no one else does of Occupy around the country. We weren't just in New York and Oakland, which got the lion's share of the attention. So we were hearing, seeing these comments from people, that like, police brutality isn't an issue for the 99%, or, the police are part of the 99%, to even more outrageous, absurd comments in the Southwest. We met some folks who were part of Occupy in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And there's one guy going on about how there's like Hispanics in the town who are stockpiling guns, getting ready for a race war. And it's, of course, this kind of like lurid settler colonialist fantasy that projecting onto them precisely what you are doing. So yeah, there were a lot of people with screwed up attitudes, but that was a good thing because the left was reaching the kind of this center of America. What Occupy did was it occupied the political center in a way that it has only rarely done in U.S. history. I mean, maybe it did some of that in the 1960s. I think you probably really have to go back to the 1930s to when the left was really occupying the center of national discussion. But unfortunately, because there wasn't any real organization, because the left has become so kind of, at that point, it had been so enfeebled, you didn't have groups with a national base. I'm not sure if DSA could do this now, Democratic Socialists of America, but they're probably better placed than anyone has been in a few generations to, if a new upsurge like that happened, that they could go into these spaces and help people do the educational work, where you engage them in a way to bring them along, not browbeat them. The problem is the internet culture, the social media culture, this type of free-for-all, it really ends up valorizing soapboxing. People getting up and denouncing people who don't have the perfectly formed ideas.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are talking about Occupy Wall Street. 10 years later, our guest is Arun Gupta. Arun Gupta is founding editor of the Occupy Wall Street Journal. He now has an article out in these times called "How Occupy Wall Street Trained a Generation in Class War." Arun Gupta, I also felt maybe one of the things, if we could talk about the legacy of Occupy and how the first few years after it had a lot of people were pretty negative about it, and that it failed, and a lot of people became disinfected towards Occupy. And I think a lot of that had to do was with the clashes within Occupy and the infighting that I think turned a lot of people away.
Yeah, there was kind of I have a saying about movements as well as people, that their strengths are their weaknesses. So the thing is, Occupy, you'll see a lot of very sharp political organizers who are just like, oh, Occupy was a tactic. And I'm like, that's not true. Occupy was actually strategic. Occupy brought the people into being because it introduced, it made widely popular, things like "We Are the 99%." And unfortunately, no David Graeber, the renowned anthropologist who passed away last year. He did not invent that saying. I heard him claim that before. Michael Goldwartofsky, in his book The Occupiers, breaks down the history of the term, but it popularized "We Are the 99%." You then had the tactic of the mic check, where that's how you can speak to a large crowd without amplification. One person would go mic check, the crowd would go mic check, and then they said, something like, "We are here today," and the whole crowd would repeat, "We are here today." And what that does is it doesn't just, repeat the words for everyone to hear. It actually makes it participatory. It makes the individuals feel like they are part of this living singular entity. And this was done in the General Assemblies, right? So again, it was something that was bringing everyone together in this tangible participatory democracy. But most important, what Occupy did was by having these physical camps, it had this incredible leveling experience that was so important, because anyone could come into the space and be like, what can I do? And you didn't need to read books of theory. You didn't need to have gone to an organizing school or have 6 years of experience being a union organizer, or working with some like student, like like United Students Against Sweatshops, and they all do great work. But what you end up doing is creating a political and organizing ecosystem that values skill and knowledge, and thereby values a certain class and racial and gender background. And so Occupy just flattened all that. And so that's the positive aspect of horizontalism. But it's a double-edged sword. And so the problem is, and we would see this and hear this across the country, that you would have like general assemblies where they would spend hours debating, where do we put the recycling? Do we put it here or do we put it over there? And just like, people are not, you had people who would be like, coming from work, especially where you're dealing with like cities like Los Angeles, right? Where it's just like the reason people have such nice rides in Southern California is because it's your second home. I got it. I've lived in LA before. I get it. You want a nice ride because you're spending so much time in that vehicle. And so people were like, they would work all day, they'd have families, and they were taking this precious time out in their evening to come down to the Occupy camp. But you had this division between the people who were living at home, and there were various terms for the people who were at Occupy. One of them was hard grounders, right? The people who were sleeping right on the concrete, they're there all the time. And so they would just be arguing and debating about whatever. And people were going down and being like, I don't know how to plug in, and I just can't, what's the point of me coming here if you're going to talk about where to put the recycling for hours? And so they supported it, but they ended up going back home. And what it ended up doing was basically giving the most space to the people who have the most time. And the unfortunate reality is the people who have the most time are the people who have the least organizing experience, the least organizing skills, because they were coming there without an actual base behind them. They weren't part of a community, of an organizing group, because if they were, they would be going back to their community and group and be doing this work. And so you end up with, people who may be well-meaning, but they really don't know how to organize, and they're trying to reinvent the wheel. It would attract, one of the things I say about Occupy is it lifted the rug on society. It obviously didn't create the homelessness. It didn't create the problem with addiction, people with mental health. It didn't create people who had socialization issues. It bought a lot of it out in the open, but maybe that's not the healthiest foundation to be organizing with. And so because it had this open model, and what we would see is people who were the loudest, the most belligerent, the most persistent, would end up sucking up the most time. And then it became a feedback loop, because more and more experienced people would just start to drift away. And so you got more people who didn't know what they're doing or didn't have proper socialization skills, and it started to eat itself alive. And by the spring of 2012, there were occupations that were still going on well into the spring of summer of 2012 in places like Little Rock and Boise and Salt Lake City and Tampa. It was kind of the second tier cities that had these physical occupations. Nashville went on for a long time. Um, but they just didn't know what to do. In Little Rock, they had this great occupation. They were given this spit of land, essentially a huge empty parking lot, and they had solar panels, they had showers, they had their own bus, they had this huge kitchen and this tent where they could fit like 30, 40 people and have music. And we were like, so what are you doing in terms of organizing? Are you going around knocking on doors? And they were like, no, we're like printing out these move on petitions and standing on corners trying to get people to sign them. And and we're just like, okay. They didn't, and it's not their fault, it's not to blame them. But when you have this type of horizontalist model, that says you don't have any skill, that no one has any more skills than anyone else, no one has any more knowledge than anyone else, we're just all going to hash it out together. I think this is inevitably what it leads to. Or if it doesn't lead to that, it leads to the co-optation I'm talking about. Or in the best case scenario, I think honestly, you have principled left organizations who come in and work with people to train them, to radicalize them. But you need, in the 1930s, we had those organizations, right? The socialist organizations, the Communist Party, the anarchist organizations, where they had hundreds, thousands of committed cadre who were going to go and do this just heavy lifting and to try and bring people into this radical politics. And of course, the times were also different. 1930s is probably the height of the proletarian moment, but in the 2010s, we see very much a return to class language, right? That is one of the greatest gifts of Occupy, is it made economic class crystal clear in very simple, understandable terms. I've heard Walmart cashiers talk about the 99% and 1%. Everyone gets it now, and that's thanks to Occupy Wall Street. Bernie Sanders' campaign said in 2016, we could not have had such an outpouring of support if it wasn't for Occupy Wall Street. Shama Sawant, the first socialist elected to a citywide office in a major city in Seattle in 2013, credited Occupy with opening a space for victory. Now we've seen this spate of candidates, the AOCs, Rashida Tlaib's, Jabal Bowman, Cori Bush, India Walton. This space has now opened up, that socialism is now part of the national conversation. And that is all thanks to Occupy. Because if we go back, remember, it was right before Occupy, it was all about Tea Party austerity. Obama was going to reach this grand bargain to basically gut Social Security and Medicare, old age security, to cut the deficit and the debt, which was pure insanity. At the time, because that was the great mistake of the Great Depression and FDR's economic policy, which was you do not cut spending. In fact, you got to keep increasing spending. And now we finally we'll see if it gets through, but these bills calling for trillions of dollars in essentially a modest wealth redistribution. They're not really going after the wealth of the 1%. They're going after more the income. But this it's hard to imagine this would have happened prior to, almost impossible to imagine this would have happened prior to Occupy Wall Street. Because again, if we go back, the Democratic Party, they were fully committed to neoliberalism, right? That's what the Clinton era was really about, which is he fulfilled the Reagan Revolution. He did the things that Ronald Reagan was unable to. It was Bill Clinton who got NAFTA passed and made into law. It was Bill Clinton who gutted social welfare. The move to repeal Glass-Steagall, the Depression era law putting some constraints on the financial industry. The Reagan administration wanted to do away with it, but it was Bill Clinton and Robert Rubin. And the Commodities Future Modernization Act, that was Bill Clinton. He really made Reaganism a reality. The mass incarceration, the supercharging of the prison industrial complex, the 100,000 cops on the street. If I remember the statistic correctly, something like the increase in Black women being incarcerated was something like 800% during the 1990s. That's, of course, because you're dealing with a very low baseline, but it's still just an absolute shocking increase. The anti-immigrant law, the Effective Death Penalty and Terrorist Act. This is where you're both freeing up capitalism while creating this, repressive architecture that is still plaguing us to this day. And so finally, we're starting to see, the potential for maybe reversing some of this neoliberal revolution that's been going on, the class warfare, the warfare of the 1% against the 99%. But this all begins in Occupy Wall Street, and we have to remember that. But I think Occupy Wall Street has really reached its limit. It's been an incredible decade. There's been real gains that need to be built on, that need to be recognized, such as this language of class war by the lower classes, by the working classes, fighting back for the first time in generations by these tactics and skills. But it's not going to go further without strategy, without organization, without leadership. Because what we saw with the George Floyd protests is, sure, you can turn out millions of people who are protesting police brutality, police violence, racist policing. And the police response was more of all of the above. More police brutality, more racist policing. People in 2020, that the summer, there were numerous people killed at these demonstrations, which started with George Floyd being killed. Cops were killing people, or these right-wing self-styled militia like Kyle Rittenhouse were basically allowed to show up and kill people. There was one day, I think it was May 30th, 2020, where 8 people lost an eye in one day around the country from these police potentially lethal munitions. You saw just thousands and thousands of arrests and draconian prison sentences, just these horrific sights of mass gassings, like people in Philadelphia who were trapped on a freeway and then the police just started gassing them all. Things like that are horrifying. And also the police around the country that are essentially, we're in a very dangerous time now because the police are basically giving up some of their monopoly on the use of force to these fascist militias, these gangs, these would-be warlords like the Proud Boys. Enrique Tarrio, the grifter, he's a grifting criminal who's now in prison. I've interviewed him before. He's an anti-black guy. He told me that black people are more violent because they listen to hip hop. This is something that Rush Limbaugh would say. He's now in prison for setting that Black Lives Matter banner on fire in Washington, D.C. last fall. And he says he's working on his memoirs, and they're going to be called American Warlord. Right. And this is a very dangerous moment. Now, I'm not one of these people who are like, oh, we're headed to civil war, because the Civil War was, it had economic underpinnings. There is no economic system like slavery that is being fought over. But I think we are potentially headed for an era of low-level terrorism, where events like Oklahoma City, the Walmart massacre, the Tree of Life, the MAGA bomber become more and more common. But the lesson of all this is the spontaneous protests don't really work when the state ups the violence, when the state allows these fascist gangs free reign. Because, one thing I saw happen in Portland, I was there last summer during those incredible protests, and you had like over 5,000 people turning out. But within a few months, the reality is 99% of the people were off the streets. And a lot of that, the main cause was the police violence, the fascist violence, but the left was also turning on itself, in a very ugly way, because so much is now done through social media. We know that social media basically has created a political economy of outrage, that you can make money by being a horrible person. Exhibit A, Glenn Greenwald, right? And kind of the whole gang like the Matt Taibbi, who's unfortunately gone off the deep end, but there's also like just outright grifters like Andy No, or this guy Michael Tracy. They make money by being horrible people, and that filters down because you get attention by attacking other people. And so, I would be talking to journalists and activists in Portland who it's just like, it is constant like feces flinging into the fan, because people are just constantly attacking each other on social media. You don't even necessarily know who they are because they're using pseudonyms. They're hiding behind, like, they'll start a thing that looks like a group, but it's really just one person. And people no longer want to engage. And so it leaves the street to violent police, violent fascists, and this hardcore of angry, paranoid leftists who are geared up to do combat. And the only way out of this dilemma is through organization, is through strategy, is through discipline, is through leadership, all of the things that Occupy Wall Street lacked.
Finally, Arun Gupta, I want to ask you about, and maybe to speculate a little bit about how you think Occupy will be remembered in history. And for me, I've always thought, and this isn't a deep study that I've done, but just looking at it, that it kind of reminded me, and I've always seen it as our own Paris Commune of 1871. This is something that Paris Commune only lasts 6 weeks, but it would have a huge effect, including in politics here in the United States. How do you see Occupy Wall Street in history?
So someone else compared it to the Paris Commune. I'm not going to go there and say it's going to have that profound effect. Look, I think it is definitely an important moment in history. It's a story that's still being told. There's that kind of infamous misquote about the French Revolution, where I believed who was it, Chu Enlai or something, was asked a question and he misunderstood it, and like it was something about like, what do you think about the terms about the impact of the French Revolution? And he said it's nearly 200 years later, it's too soon to tell. He was thinking the question, I think, was about 68 or something. But in any case, I think in this case it is still too soon to tell. We have seen positive effects. I know again there's this
You think
kind
the
of like
narrative is shifting from one of it being a failure?
I think you see less and less people who are saying that. Like one of the people who was very quick to say that was Andrew Ross Sorkin, which is unfortunate because he's one of the creators of Billions, as is kind of like a trashy show that I enjoy on Showtime about billionaires. He's his business columnist for the New York Times, and the guy is kind of so out of touch during Occupy Wall Street, and he called it the frenzy that fizzled. He said it's going to be an asterisk, but this guy is such a tool of the ruling class. He actually admitted in one of his columns that a CEO of a major bank called him up and essentially told him to go down to Occupy Wall Street and check it out because he was worried if the rabble were going to come and chop his head off. And so it's just like you're taking your orders from, these basically horrible human beings. And then, you're like trying to pass judgment on Occupy Wall Street as this frenzy that fizzled. No, it was not. It just shows an utter misunderstanding. And I think it also shows an utter intellectual bankruptcy that is, the New York Times can do great journalism, but there's in general this intellectual bankruptcy. And there's also this complete dereliction of journalistic ethics and responsibility and honesty, that they do not understand what is going on. I would like draw a parallel to the last 5 years. It's just like I've been one of those people who are being like, hello, Trump's a fascist, the Proud Boys are fascists, and only after the January 6th coup do we finally see the mainstream media starting to use that term, whereas it's just like that's not the definition of fascism, a coup attempt. That doesn't make them fascist. You could have all sorts of different ideologies and have a coup attempt. What makes them fascist is blood and soil, call for national renewal, extreme notions of identity politics around gender, around race, around citizenship, ethnicity. These policies of ethnic cleansing, this is what makes them fascist. This valorization of violence as this not just as a political tool, but a social tool, an ideological tool. That makes you and powerful, that makes the state powerful. This has all been there. Trump may be an incompetent fascist. He may be a fascist with no book learning, but he's still a fascist. And same with the Proud Boys, So when I hear the mainstream media, talk about this, I'm fortunate that to know Frances Fox Piven, the renowned scholar of social movements, and she told me early on, anyone who says it's spontaneous they're only admitting they don't understand the social and political context for where Occupy came out of. And she also said, in 2011, right away, I think this is the beginning of a very great movement. And these movements take at least a decade to unfold. And she was the one who turned out to be right. Not these ruling class hacks like Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Arun Gupta was a founding editor of the Occupy Wall Street Journal. He has joined us to talk about Occupy Wall Street 10 years later. He has an article out in these times called How Occupy Wall Street Trained a Generation in Class War. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Bacon as a Weapon of Mass Destruction, a junk food loving chef's inquiry into taste. Once that does come out, sir, we'll have you on to talk about that. But I do thank you for taking this time today.
Thank you for having me on, Mitch. Always a pleasure.